In an era before borders became high walls, there was a kingdom so massive that the ground literally trembled whenever its armies moved. Its monarch held enough gold to bury cities, yet he was known by a single title across the realm, the Foolish King. He lived by the conviction that the world functioned through raw commands rather than logic. He once formally ordered the sun to set 2 hours early because he preferred a cooler breeze for his evening walk. When a minister pointed out that the sun followed its own path, the king had him flogged for doubting the royal reach. Life in the palace became a performance of survival. Courtiers competed to see who could praise the king's most nonsensical decrees as the peak of human wisdom, effectively sealing the throne room off from reality. Eventually, the king grew bored of easy praise and announced a high-stakes contest. Anyone who could answer his questions to his satisfaction would win half the empire, but anyone who failed would be locked in a dungeon for life. This wasn't a search for truth, but a trap for the ego. When power is absolute and unchecked, it creates a void where the ruler's whims replace the laws of nature. In the shadow of this palace lived a dervish. He slept in a ruined inn and owned nothing but a wooden bowl and a tattered cloak, yet even the wealthiest merchants lowered their eyes when he walked by. While the king measured his worth in velvet and stone, the dervish insisted a true ruler is defined by a clean heart, not his headgear. When the dervish entered the court to face the king's challenge, the guards mocked his bare feet and tangled hair. He told them he had come to bring a message of life to a room that only knew how to trade in death. The king set the first riddle. He demanded the dervish identify the single heaviest thing in the universe and the single lightest. The dervish filled his wooden bowl with water and answered, "The heaviest thing is a person's sin, which pulls them toward the earth and denies them rest. The lightest is their intention, which shifts the moment a hint of greed blows by." By pointing to the character of the soul, the dervish pulled the king onto a battlefield where his gold and armies had no value. The king then asked about the path that no traveler ever returns from. The dervish replied that it is yesterday, a road that no amount of wealth or force can ever reopen. Sensing he was losing control of the room, the king threw a diamond ring at the dervish's feet. He demanded the dervish read his exact thoughts, or the guards would take his life that very night. The dervish looked at the king's tight grip on his throne and his desperate need for a wrong answer to justify his anger. He told the king he was thinking 2 things. First, that if the dervish was right, the king's pride would be ruined. And second, he was terrified that the world was right to call him a fool. The king didn't call the guards. He climbed down from the throne and invited the dervish to stay for 7 days. 7 full days, 7 distinct questions, and 7 tests. If the dervish finished them all, he would be named Grand Vizier. For the first time, the king stopped trying to win and started trying to understand. Exposing the fear behind a leader's anger is often the only way to make them listen. On the first day, the king brought a golden bird in a cage. It hadn't eaten for 3 days, despite being offered the world's finest grains. He challenged the dervish to save it. The dervish simply reached out and opened the door. The bird instantly flew to a tree, eating common grass. He explained that a fool tries to give others what he values, while a wise person gives them what they actually need. Freedom was the only thing the bird was hungry for. On the 3rd day, they visited a field where 2 brothers were trying to kill each other over a strip of inherited land. Both claimed it was theirs and theirs alone. The dervish put his ear to the ground and then told the brothers the land had spoken. It said it didn't belong to either of them. Rather, both of them belonged to the earth, and soon it would claim them both, just as it had their father. The king presented a math problem. With fixed grain and a growing population, a zero-sum calculation showed everyone would die. The dervish handed a boy a net. Giving grain creates beggars, but capability makes a kingdom. Turn consumers into producers. Finally, on a high tower overlooking the city, the king asked if his brilliance hadn't created all this light. The dervish pointed to the dark alleys below, explaining that true greatness is measured by how much light reaches the houses that can't afford oil, not by how high the tower stands. These lessons dismantled the king's old world. He began to see that his power wasn't a prize to be protected, but a tool meant to be used for the benefit of those he had previously ignored. But the palace ministers were watching with growing alarm. A wise king meant an end to the era where they could steal from the treasury while the monarch was distracted by his own ego. They knew that if the dervish stayed, he would eventually look at the books and find 10 years of systemic theft and hidden debts. They stole the king's most famous diamond, the Koh-i-Noor, and hid it in the dervish's bag. By morning, the palace was in an uproar. The plan worked. The king's newly found patience vanished, replaced by the old, familiar rage. He felt betrayed by the one man he had finally learned to trust. When a system of corruption is threatened by transparency, it will almost always invent a crisis to force the leader back into their old, predictable habits. The king roared at the dervish in front of the entire court, demanding his diamond back. The dervish stood perfectly still, watching the man he thought he had reached slip back into the role of a tyrant. Everything stops here. The 6 days of lessons and the years of foolishness are colliding in this one moment of decision. It's one thing to agree with a philosophy when life is going well. It's an entirely different thing to hold on to those values when you feel cheated, angry, and powerful enough to destroy your enemies with a single word. Like the king, we are given the blueprints for justice and humility, but we only find out if we've actually learned them when we are tested by our own instincts to lash out and revert to our old ways. A monarch can conquer 1,000 cities with a large enough army, but the hardest border to cross is the one that leads